She was standing in the middle of a hotel ballroom in a dress that cost more than her first car, holding a glass of champagne she hadn't touched, watching the man she was supposed to marry in 4 weeks, slow, dancing with her best friend. Not her former best friend, her best friend present tense. The woman who had helped her pick out the wedding invitations just 3 days ago. The woman who had cried at the engagement party and said, "You two are the most perfect couple I've ever seen." That woman right now, in Marcus's arms, his hand on the small of her back, her head on his shoulder. Both of them completely unaware that Lena was standing 15 feet away, perfectly still, like someone had reached into her chest and yanked something out. The music kept playing, people kept laughing, waiters kept moving through the crowd with silver trays, and Lena just stood there, watching her entire life quietly fall apart in real time. She didn't scream, she didn't throw the champagne, she didn't cry. She just set the glass down on the nearest table, picked up her coat, and walked out the front door into the cold night air. And she kept walking until the sound of the party disappeared completely behind her. Before we go any further, if you are new here, please subscribe to this channel right now. Share this video with someone who needs to hear a story like this, and drop a comment below telling me what you think Lena should do next. Your support is what keeps these stories coming. Now let's get back to what happens next. Lena had grown up in a world where appearances were everything. Her mother had taught her that before she could even read. You smile when you are hurting. You dress well when you feel small. You never let them see you break. Her mother had lived by that rule her entire life, and it had cost her everything, and somehow Lena had still absorbed it like a second language. She was 34 years old. She ran a small but respected interior design firm in the city. She had built it herself from nothing, starting with a folding table in her apartment and a second-hand laptop. She had real clients now, real projects, a small team of 4 people who genuinely liked working for her. She had a life she was proud of, and then there was Marcus. Marcus came from old money, not the quiet, understated kind, the loud kind, the kind that wore its wealth like a costume and expected everyone around it to be grateful for the opportunity to be nearby. His family had a name in this city. His mother sat on charity boards. His father played golf with senators. And for 2 years, Marcus had made Lena feel like she was finally being let into a world that had always kept its doors just slightly closed to her. She had loved him. She was almost certain of that. Or maybe she had loved the feeling of being chosen by him. She was honest enough with herself, walking alone in the cold that night, to admit she wasn't entirely sure which one it was. What she was sure of was this. The gala was in 3 weeks, the Hartfield Foundation Gala, the single most important social event in the city, attended by everyone who mattered in Marcus's world. His family would be there, his colleagues, the people who had looked at Lena over the last 2 years with polite, barely disguised curiosity, as if they were still deciding whether she was good enough. And Marcus had already announced, in a newsletter that went out to 400 people, that he would be attending with his fiancée. Lena stopped walking. She was standing in front of a gas station. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A man in a grey jacket was pumping gas into an old truck, and the air smelled like cold metal and motor oil. She stood there for a long moment, thinking. She was not going to let Marcus walk into that gala and have people feel sorry for her. She was not going to be the woman who got left. She was not going to give his mother the satisfaction of that particular expression, the one that said, "I always knew she wasn't right for him." She was going to walk into that gala. She just needed someone to walk in with her. The idea, when it came to her, was not a good idea. She knew that immediately. It had the shape of a decision made by someone who was tired and humiliated and running on pure stubbornness, which is exactly what it was. But she had also learned, over 34 years, that sometimes the stubborn decisions are the ones that change everything. Her car had been in the shop for 2 weeks. The mechanic's shop was 3 blocks from her apartment. She had walked past it every morning on her way to get coffee, and every morning the same man was there, working. Not the owner, she assumed, just a mechanic, quiet, focused. He had dark hair that was always slightly messy, and he wore the same worn jacket almost every day, and he never looked up from whatever he was working on, unless someone spoke to him directly. She had spoken to him exactly twice, once to drop off her car, once to pick it up. Both times he had been polite, professional, and completely uninterested in small talk, which she had found refreshing in a way she couldn't quite explain. His name was Steve. She knew almost nothing else about him, which is why the next morning when she walked into that shop and said, "I need to ask you something strange," the look on his face was completely unreadable. He was standing under a truck, and he slid out on a creeper and looked up at her, and she said it before she could change her mind. "I need someone to pretend to be my husband at a black tie gala in 3 weeks. I will pay you well. You won't have to talk much. I just need someone who can stand next to me and look like he belongs." There was a very long pause, he said. "Why me?" she said. "Because I don't know you well enough to be embarrassed in front of you." He looked at her for another long moment. His expression didn't change much, but something shifted behind his eyes, something she couldn't read. Then he said, "How much?" She named a number. It was more than fair. She had checked her savings account before she walked over. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll need a suit." She said, "I'll handle the suit." He said, "Okay." And that was it. That was how it started. What Lena did not know, and would not know for some time, was that Steve already owned 3 suits. Not off-the-rack suits, bespoke suits made by a tailor in Milan, hanging in a closet in a penthouse apartment on the other side of the city that she had never seen, and would never have guessed existed. Steve's full name was Stephen Calloway, and the Calloway name, if you followed the money in American manufacturing, appeared on the paperwork of 14 automotive plants across 7 states. It appeared on the deed of a research and development facility in Michigan that employed over 3,000 people. It appeared on the founding documents of a company that, in 20 years, had gone from a single garage in Ohio to one of the largest privately held automotive empires in the country. His father had started it. Steve had built it into what it was now, and then, 18 months ago, following the death of his father, and a very public and very painful falling out with his board of directors over the direction of the company, Steve had done something that confused everyone who knew him. He had disappeared. Not literally, he was still running the company, still making decisions, still taking calls, but he had moved out of the penthouse. Not sold it, just moved out. He had found a small apartment. He had started working with his hands again, the way he had when he was young, when his father's garage was the only place in the world that made sense to him. He had taken a job at a mechanic's shop under his middle name told the owner he was between things, and the owner, who was 62 and had bad knees and needed reliable help, had asked no question. Steve had been there for 4 months. When Lena walked in with her broken car, he had noticed her immediately, not in a dramatic way, just in the way you notice someone who is clearly carrying something heavy but refuses to put it down. She was always polished, always put together, always moving like she was slightly behind schedule. But there was something in her eyes when she thought no one was looking, something that reminded him of the way he felt in board meetings, sitting at the head of a table surrounded by people, completely alone. He had not planned to say yes to her strange request. He had genuinely not planned it, but when she looked at him and said, "I don't know you well enough to be embarrassed in front of you," something about that honesty, the plain, undefended honesty of it, had caught him somewhere he wasn't ready for. So he said yes. And then he went home to his small apartment, sat at his kitchen table, and thought about what he had just agreed to. The next 3 weeks were not what either of them expected. Lena had imagined a simple transaction. She would brief him on the basics, who Marcus was, what the gala was, what she needed from him. He would show up, play the part, and leave. She would get through the night with her dignity intact. Everyone would go home. What she had not planned for was Steve being genuinely bad at pretending. Not in a clumsy way, in an honest way. When she sat across from him at a coffee shop 5 days before the event to go over the plan, She explained that he needed to seem like a man who was comfortable in that world, confident, polished, she said. You need to act like you've been to events like this before. He looked at her and said, without any irony at all, "What if I just act like myself?" She said. "That won't work. These people are very particular." He said. "What kind of people are they?" She said. "Rich, careful, judgmental." He nodded slowly, looking at his coffee. Then he said, "Are they happy?" She stopped. She thought about it. She thought about Marcus's mother, who had everything and smiled, like a woman holding a frown in place with pure willpower. She thought about Marcus's colleagues, who competed with each other at every dinner they attended, keeping score of things she could never quite identify. She said, "No, not really." Steve said, "Then I won't have any trouble fitting in." She didn't know what to do with that. She wrote it off as a strange thing to say and moved on. But that night, alone in her apartment, she kept thinking about it. He came to pick her up on the night of the gala, and she opened the door, and for a moment she didn't say anything. He was wearing the suit she had arranged, dark navy, simple, well cut. His hair was neat. He looked, she would think later, like a man who had dressed this way before, which should have struck her as odd given everything she thought she knew about him. He looked at her and said, "You look like you are ready for a fight." She said, "Is that bad?" He said, "No, I like it." She picked up her clutch, and they walked out together, and she told herself this was just a performance, just a single evening, and then it would be over. The gala was held at the Hartfield estate, a sprawling property 40 minutes outside the city, the kind of place that existed to make ordinary people feel ordinary. Grand entrance, chandeliers, string quartet, the kind of room where money expressed itself quietly and constantly. They walked in together, and immediately Lena felt the shift. People noticed. People always noticed new arrivals, especially unexpected ones. She saw 2 women near the entrance whisper to each other. She saw Marcus's colleague, David Hartfield himself, look over from across the room with an expression she couldn't immediately place. And then she saw Marcus. He was standing near the bar, and he saw her at almost the same moment she saw him, and something moved across his face that she had never seen there before. Something she realized, with a small shock, was panic. He had not expected her to come, and he had absolutely not expected her to come with someone. She kept her eyes forward. She let her hand rest on Steve's arm. She smiled the smile her mother had taught her, the one that gives nothing away, and she moved into the room like she owned it. Steve, beside her, was completely calm. Here is where the night stopped being simple. David Hartfield, the man hosting the event, crossed the room toward them within minutes of their arrival. He was 60, silver-haired, immaculately dressed. He was also, though Lena did not know this, a man who had spent the last 3 years trying and failing to negotiate a strategic partnership with Callaway Automotive. He reached them. He shook Lena's hand warmly, said something polite about her firm, and then he turned to Steve. And something very interesting happened. David Hartfield looked at Steve's face, really looked at it, and his expression went through several things very quickly: confusion, recognition, and then a careful blankness that people learn when they spend a lot of time in rooms where information is power. He said, "Steve, this is unexpected." Steve said, "David, good to see you." Lena looked between them. She said, "You two know each other." David laughed, a small, careful laugh. He said, "We've crossed paths." He looked at Steve with an expression she couldn't read. "I didn't realize you were back in circulation," Steve said. "I am not. I am just here with my wife." Lena felt the word land somewhere in her chest. She kept her face still. Wife, he had said it so simply, so easily, like it was the most natural thing in the world. David looked at her. Then back at Steve, he said, "Of course. Well, enjoy the evening." And he moved away. Lena waited until they were out of earshot. Then she said, quietly, "How do you know David Hartfield?" Steve said, "He has tried to do business with me before." She said, "What kind of business?" He said, "The boring kind." She said, "What do you do exactly?" I realized I never actually asked. He looked at her, and for a moment, just a moment, she saw something shift behind his eyes again, that same thing she had seen in the shop, the thing she couldn't name. He said, I work with cars. She decided for now to let that be enough. But the night was not done with them. Marcus found her an hour in. She had expected him to avoid her. That would have been the easier choice for him. But Marcus had never been a man who chose easy when he could choose impressive. He came to her with a glass of wine and a smile that she now recognized as a performance, and said, "Lena, you look wonderful," she said. "Thank you." He looked at Steve. He said, "I don't think we've met." Steve said, "No." There was a pause. Marcus was the kind of man who filled silences. He said, "Marcus Vane, Lena and I are old friends," Lena said. "We were engaged." She watched the word hit him. He kept his smile in place, barely. He said, "Right, well, water under the bridge." "And you are?" Steve looked at him for a moment, just looked at him, the way a man looks at something he has already assessed and moved on from. Then he said, "Steve." Marcus waited for a last name. None came. Marcus said, "And what do you do, Steve?" Steve said, "I work with my hands." There was something in the way he said it, quiet, completely unbothered, like the question was not interesting enough to answer fully. Marcus, who had spent his entire life using profession as a measuring stick, visibly didn't know what to do with this. He laughed, a small dismissive laugh, and said, "How lovely." Steve nodded once. He looked at Lena and said, "Do you want to dance?" She said yes before she thought about it. She had not expected him to be a good dancer. She had not expected much of anything from him physically beyond presence. But he moved with the quiet ease of someone who was comfortable in their own body. No performance in it, no effort, just natural and steady, and she found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't all evening. She said quietly, "Thank you for that." He said, "For what?" She said, "For not trying to impress him." "Why, son?" He said, "Why would I?" She said, "Most men would have." He thought about that. He said, he needed to feel like the most important person in the conversation. I didn't want to give him that. She looked up at him. She said, "That is a very specific thing to notice." He said, "I've been in a lot of rooms with men like that." She said, "Doing what?" He said, "Working." She let it go. But she was building a picture, detail by detail, and the edges of it were starting to not quite match the frame she had put around him. The night turned, as these nights always do, on a single unexpected moment. It came in the form of Marcus's mother. Victoria Vane was 71 years old and had never once in her life said something without calculating its impact first. She found them near the end of the evening, when the crowd had thinned and the champagne had flowed long enough to lower everyone's guard. She looked at Lena with that expression, the one Lena had always dreaded, the slight tilt of the head, the too soft smile. She said, "Lena, darling, it is been a while. I heard about the engagement." Lena said, "It was the right decision." Victoria said, "Of course it was." She looked at Steve with polite, practiced interest. "And this must be your new friend," Steve said, "her husband." Victoria's expression shifted slightly. She said, "I wasn't aware of a wedding." Steve said, "We kept it small." Lena, who had not planned for this particular corner of the evening, said nothing. She was watching Steve, who was looking at Victoria Vane with complete calm. The kind of calm she now recognized was not performed. It was structural. It was just who he was, Victoria said, and there was steel under the silk of it. "And what family are you from, if I may ask?" Steve said, "Ohio." Victoria said, "Ohio," exactly the way a person says a word to indicate it doesn't count. Steve said, "My grandfather worked in a factory. My father started a garage. I took over the family business." Victoria said, "And what business is that?" There was a pause, and then from across the room a voice said, "Victoria." David Hartfield had appeared at her elbow. He looked at her with an expression that said, clearly, carefully, "Stop." He said, "Have you met Steve Calloway?" Silence. Victoria Vane knew that name. Lena could see it move across her face, the name landing like something heavy dropped from a height, the calculation happening behind her eyes, rapid and visible. She said, "The Calloway." David said the same. Victoria looked at Steve. Something in her expression, for the first time in Lena's memory, was uncertain. Lena said nothing. She was looking at Steve. He was not looking at Victoria anymore. He was looking at Lena, and his expression was the one she had come to know over 3 weeks, the one that was honest when everything else in the room was theatre. He said, quietly, just to her, "I should have told you sooner," she said, just as quietly. "Told me what?" He said, "Most of it." They left 20 minutes later, not dramatically, just simply said their goodbyes, collected their coats, walked out into the cold night. The car that was waiting for them was not the car she had expected. It was a black sedan, quiet and elegant, and the driver was there before they reached the curb, which meant he had been notified somehow. She sat in the car and said nothing for a long time. He sat beside her and said nothing either. She said, "Callaway Automotive." He said, "Yes." She said, "You own it." He said, "My father started it. I run it." She said, "How large is it?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Large enough that it was a problem for a while." She said, "Why were you working as a mechanic?" He said, "Because I needed to remember what I was doing it for." She looked at him. She said, "I hired you to be my fake husband, and you are one of the wealthiest men in the country." He said, "Yes." She said, "Did you say yes because you felt sorry for me?" He said, "No." She said, "Then why?" He looked out the window. The city moved past them, lights sliding by in the dark. He said, "Because you walked into that shop and asked for help and didn't pretend you weren't asking for help. You just asked directly, like you'd already made peace with needing it." He paused. "I hadn't seen that in a long time." She looked at her hands. She thought about her mother, about the smile that gives nothing away, about all the years she had spent making sure no one could see her carrying anything heavy. She said, "I am not sure what to do with any of this." He said, "You don't have to do anything with it." She said, "You lied to me." He said, "I didn't tell you everything." "That is not the same thing," she said. "It feels the same." He said, "I know." The car was quiet. She looked at the lights. He didn't try to fill the silence, which she had come to understand was one of the most specific things about him. She said, "Why didn't you tell me?" He said, "Because you came to the shop to hire a mechanic, not a billionaire. And I didn't want you to change your mind." She said, "Why would that matter to you?" He looked at her. He said, "You already know why." She did know. She had known for about a week and a half and had been refusing to look directly at it. She looked directly at it now. She said, "This is a mess." He said, "Yes." She almost smiled. She didn't quite, but almost. What she did not know, as they rode through the city in silence, was that Marcus had spent the last 40 minutes of the gala on his phone. He had called 2 people who knew the Callaway name well enough to confirm what David Hartfield had told his mother. He had stood in a corner of the ballroom, glass in hand, watching the door through which Lena and Steve had left, with an expression that the woman beside him, his colleague's wife, would later describe as someone doing a very fast, very grim calculation. Because Marcus was a man who had let Lena go without a second thought, the moment he decided she had stopped being useful to his image. And now, in the space of a single evening, the calculation had changed completely. He told himself it was because he missed her. He was almost convincing. 3 days after the gala, Lena's phone rang at 7 in the morning. It was Marcus. She stared at the screen for a long time before she answered. He said, "I've been thinking about us," she said. "There is no us." He said, "I made a mistake, I know that. Diane meant nothing," she said. "Her name is Diane." He said, "Lena," she said, "I can't talk right now." And she hung up. She sat on the edge of her bed. She thought about the man on the dance floor. The way he had looked at Marcus, assessed him, and moved on. The way he had said the word wife just once, simply, like it cost him nothing. She thought about the fact that she was building feelings for a man she had hired to pretend. She thought about the fact that some portion of him had not been pretending. She got up, got dressed, and went to work. She did not go to the shop that week. She told herself it was because she was busy. Her firm had a new project, a large one, a commercial space downtown, and she genuinely was busy. But she was also, she would admit to herself at odd quiet moments, afraid of the next conversation. Steve, for his part, was not sitting still either. He had gone back to the shop the morning after the gala and continued his work. The owner, a man named Pete who asked few questions, had noticed that Steve seemed quieter than usual, which was notable because Steve was already the quietest person Pete had ever employed. What Steve was also doing quietly was dealing with the fallout of the gala. David Hartfield had emailed his assistant within 12 hours. 2 board members had called, and Marcus Vane had, through channels Steve found both transparent and slightly desperate, attempted to make an appointment with Steve's office in the city. Steve's office manager had replied that Mr. Calloway was not taking new meetings at this time. Steve had also done something that he told himself was not significant, but absolutely was. He had looked up Lena's design firm. He had looked at the work on their website. He had sat in his apartment at midnight, looking at photographs of rooms she had designed, the particular warmth in them, the way she used light, the way everything felt lived in rather than displayed. And he had thought about the fact that she had built this herself quietly, without a famous name or a wealthy family, and had made something genuinely beautiful. He had thought about that for a long time. She came back to the shop on a Thursday. It was late afternoon, and the light was going orange and low, and he was outside this time, working on something in the lot. He saw her coming from half a block away and straightened up slowly. She stopped in front of him. She said, "I want to ask you something." He said, "Okay." She said, "The night of the gala, when you talked to Marcus, were you enjoying it?" He thought about it. He said, "A little," she said. She said, "When you talked to Victoria Vane, were you nervous?" He said, "No." She said, "I was. I've been nervous around that woman for 2 years." He said, "I know," she said. "How did you know?" He said, "Your hand. You were holding your clutch very tightly every time she was within 10 feet of you." She stared at him. She said, "You noticed that?" He said, "I notice things," she said. "What else did you notice?" He said, "You ate nothing all evening. You were watching every door. When Marcus left the room you relaxed, and when he came back you went still again. You smiled at the right moments, but your eyes were somewhere else." He paused. "And about halfway through the evening you stopped thinking about Marcus entirely." She went very quiet. She said, "What was I thinking about?" He looked at her. He said, "I wasn't going to say." She said, "Say it." He said, "I think you were starting to wonder if you'd made the right choice coming tonight. But not because of Marcus, because you were wondering whether something else was real." The light was going down around them. Someone down the street was mowing a lawn. The ordinary world was continuing in its ordinary way, and she was standing here in the middle of something she had not planned and did not know what to call. She said, "I got a call from Marcus." Steve's expression didn't change. She said, "He wants to reconcile." Steve said, "What did you say?" She said, "I hung up." Something in him, very small and very contained, shifted. She saw it. She said, "I don't want Marcus. I want to be clear about that. But I also don't know what I want with you. If anything, if any of this is even real." He said, "Which part?" She said, "All of it. You. Who you actually are." He said, "I am the same person who was standing under that truck when you walked in." She said, "You are also the person who owns half the automotive industry." He said, "That is a separate thing." She said, "It is not a separate thing, it is who you are." He was quiet. Then he said, "My father used to say the work you do with your hands is the truest thing about you. Not what you own, not what your name is worth, what you can build and fix and make right." He looked at his hands. "I've spent 20 years building something I am proud of, and then I spent the last 18 months trying to remember why I built it. That is what I was doing here." She looked at him. She said, "Did you figure it out?" He said, "I am getting there." Worth. She stood there for another moment. Then she said, "I have a project, a big one, commercial space in the city. I need an honest opinion about the structural layout." He said, "I know about structures." She said, "I know you do." She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder of drawings. She held it out to him. He took it. He looked at the first page. He said, "Your load-bearing partition is in the wrong place." She said, "I know. I've been arguing with my contractor about it for a week." He said, "You are right and he is wrong." She said, "How do you know?" He said, "Because I can read a drawing and I've built things." She almost smiled. This time she let herself. They started meeting twice a week, not dates, Neither of them called them dates. She would bring a problem from the project. He would look at it, think about it, offer an observation. She would argue with him sometimes, and sometimes she was right, and sometimes he was. And gradually the project problems became fewer, and the conversations became longer. She learned things about him slowly, the way you learn a language by living in it rather than studying it. She learned that he had grown up in Ohio in a house with 3 bedrooms and 1 bathroom, and a father who worked 18-hour days and still came home to have dinner with his family every night. She learned that he had built his first engine at 12, that he had turned down 2 college scholarships because he didn't want to leave his father's shop, that his father had died 14 months ago, and that he had not really dealt with it yet, had just moved it somewhere interior and kept working. He learned things about her too, that she had worked 2 jobs through her 20s to save enough to start her firm, that her mother had died when Lena was 27, and that the design work she did was partly a way of building the kind of home her mother had never been able to afford, that she had loved Marcus's world more than she had loved Marcus, and that realizing that had hurt her more than the betrayal had. One afternoon, sitting at a table with her drawings spread between them, he said, "You are going to be fine." She said, "I know." He said, "I mean with the project, the structural issue is solvable." She said, "I know that too." He said, "I was also saying the other thing." She looked at him. She said, "I know." Marcus did not give up. He appeared at her office one afternoon unannounced, carrying coffee and wearing an expression she recognized as his most carefully constructed version of sincere. Her assistant let him in before checking with her, and she came out of her office to find him standing in her waiting area, and she stopped. She said, "You need to leave." He said, "Just 5 minutes." She said, "No." "Where?" He said, "Lena, I know what I did. I am not excusing it, but I've been thinking about us, and I think what we had was real, and I think you know it." She said, "What I know is that you danced with my best friend at an event where you were supposed to be representing our relationship. And before you tell me it was nothing, I watched the 2 of you for 4 minutes before you saw me, and it was not nothing." He was quiet. Then he said, "Diane is not in the picture." She said, "I don't care." He said, "You came to the gala with a mechanic." She said, "I came to the gala with a person I respect." He said, "Lena, he is not what you think he is." She said, "I know exactly what he is." Something moved across Marcus's face, something she would think about later. He said, "Do you? Because from where I stand, you've been spending time with a man who hid a very significant identity from you, who didn't tell you who he was, who let you believe." She said, "He worked with his hands and told me the truth about what mattered. You wore a beautiful suit and told me what I wanted to hear. I know which one I prefer." Marcus looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "He is not going to want what you want. Men like that with what he has, they don't settle into the life you are building." She said, "Men like what?" He said, "Men with that much, they always go back to it." She said, "You need to leave now." He left. She stood in her office for a long time afterward. She thought about what Marcus had said. She thought about whether there was a version of it that was true. She thought about a man in a worn jacket, sliding out from under a truck, looking up at her like the question she was asking was the most normal thing in the world. She thought, he is going to go back to it eventually. Back to the company, back to the life, back to everything that is actually his. And she thought, what am I to him in that world? She didn't bring it up for 2 weeks. She turned it over and lived with it and kept meeting him and kept arguing about load-bearing walls and kept watching him become more visible to her day by day. And she kept thinking about Marcus's words and kept telling herself they didn't apply. And then one evening, sitting in a coffee shop with the drawings between them, she said it. She said, "You are going to go back." He looked up. She said, "To the company, to the real life. Whatever is waiting for you there, you are going to go back to it." He said, "Who told you I was gone from it?" She said, "You know what I mean." He put the drawing down. He said, "Lena," she said, "I am not asking you to stay. I am not making demands. I just want to be honest with you because I think you've been honest with me mostly, and I want to know if this," she gestured between them, "means something to you, or if I am something that happened while you were taking a break from your real life." He looked at her for a long moment. She held his eyes. She had decided she was done being a woman who looks away first. He said, "I never stopped running the company. I take calls every day. I make decisions. I have a board I disagree with constantly. Nothing stopped. I just needed to be somewhere that reminded me what the point of it was," she said. "And did you find it?" He said, "Yes," she said. "What is it?" he said. "Building things that last. Not acquiring, not expanding for its own sake. Building things that are worth building." He looked at her. "And being honest about what you want instead of what is expected of you." She said, "And what do you want?" he said. "You know what I want," she said. "I need you to say it." He said, "I want this, whatever this is. I want more of it," she said, "even when it gets complicated." He said, "Everything worth having is complicated." She looked at him. She said, "I am still angry that you didn't tell me earlier." He said, "That is fair." She said, "And I am still figuring out how I feel about the fact that the man I hired to be my fake husband turns out to be someone I actually want to know." He said, "How is that going?" She said, "It is going." Outside the window, the city moved in its ordinary way. People walked past with their ordinary burdens. The world continued. Inside the coffee shop, something very small and very serious and very real was beginning. 2 weeks later, Lilina got a call from a number she didn't recognize. She answered it, and the voice on the other end was a woman, professional, smooth, who said she was calling from the Callaway Corporate Communications office and that there was a matter they needed to discuss. Lena said, "What kind of matter?" The woman said, "We've become aware that you attended the Hartfield gala and that you were in Darkus, his wife. We want to understand the nature of your relationship before there is any public statement required," Lena said. The woman said, "Mr. Callaway's absence from public life has been noted in certain quarters. His attendance at a high-profile event has generated some interest. There are people asking questions," Lena said. "What kind of questions?" The woman said, "About who you are, about the nature of the relationship, about whether there are implications for the company's governance and ownership structure." Lena put the phone down on the table. She looked at it. She picked it up and said, "Tell whoever needs to know that I have no comment." And she hung up. She sat very still. Then she texted Steve. She said, "Your office called me." He replied in under a minute. "I know. I am sorry. I am handling it." She said, "What does handling it mean?" He said, "It means I am telling them it is none of their business." She said, "Is it going to become a problem?" He said, "Probably." She said, "You should have thought of that before you said the word wife to David Hartfield." He took longer to reply this time. Then he said, "You are right. I wasn't thinking clearly." She said, "Why not?" Another pause. "Then because I was looking at you." She put the phone face down on the table. She looked at the ceiling. She thought, "This is either the beginning of something extraordinary or the beginning of something that is going to hurt very much." And she thought, "I am done making decisions based on fear of being hurt." She picked the phone back up. She said, "Okay, tell me what we're dealing with." What they were dealing with was this. Steve's board of directors had been waiting for 18 months for a sign of instability, something they could use to argue that Steve's distance from the company was hurting its leadership. A billionaire CEO who had gone to ground appeared at one of the country's most visible social events with an unknown woman, introduced her as his wife, and then disappeared back into obscurity was, from a corporate governance perspective, exactly the kind of story that could be made into something damaging. There were 2 board members in particular, men named Walsh and Foreman, who had wanted to move the company toward a public offering for 3 years. Steve had refused. They had been waiting for leverage ever since. The gala had given them a thread to pull. Steve told Lena all of this in her apartment on a Sunday morning. He sat at her kitchen table and explained it clearly, the way he explained everything, without drama, without minimizing, just the facts and what they meant. She said, "So I've accidentally given your enemies ammunition." He said, "It is not your fault." She said, "I hired you to be my husband." He said, "I agreed." She said, "Why didn't you think about this?" he said. "Because I wasn't thinking about the company." She looked at him. She said, "Steve," he said, "I know." She said, "What do you want to do?" He said, "I want to deal with Walsh and Foreman directly. I've been avoiding that conversation for 18 months, and it is time to have it." She said, "And what about us, this situation?" He said, "We can explain the truth, or we can let them be confused. Either way, it is manageable." "Wally, chole tibai," she said. "The truth is that I hired you to pretend to be my husband so I could make my cheating ex-fiancé comfortable at a party." He said, "Yes," she said. "That is going to sound strange." He said, "Most true things do." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, He said, "Or what?" She said, "What if we didn't have to explain anything? What if we just continued?" He said, "What do you mean?" She said, "I mean, what if whatever this is, we just let it be whatever it is, and the board and David Hartfield and Walsh and Foreman and Marcus and everyone else can draw their own conclusions." He looked at her across the table. He said, "You are suggesting we stop defining it for other people." She said, "I am suggesting we stop letting other people be the reason we define it at all." He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "Okay," she said, "Okay." He said, "Yes, okay." She said, "You are very easy to agree with when you agree." He said, "I've been told I am stubborn." She said, "You are, but you are also right when you are right." He said, "So are you." She looked at him. He looked at her outside her window. The city went about its business. The board meeting happened 3 weeks later. Steve went back to the city. He walked into the building he had built, took the elevator to the 38th floor, sat at the head of the table in the room where he had made decisions that affected thousands of people's lives, and he looked at Walsh and Foreman and every other person at that table. And he said, "I've been away. I needed to be. Here is where we are, and here is where we're going." He had spent 2 weeks preparing. He had come back with a plan for the company's next decade, not a public offering, not a sale, but a structural expansion that would protect the workforce, grow the value, and establish a foundation in manufacturing research that he believed was the most important thing the company could do. He laid it out clearly, simply, the way he did everything. Walsh tried to interrupt twice. Steve let him finish both times and then responded directly. Foreman pushed for the public offering again. Steve explained why it would harm the workforce in the long term. He had numbers, he had research, he had a plan. At the end of 2 hours, he called a vote on his proposal. It passed 6-2. He shook hands with the two who had voted against him, which surprised them, and then he took the elevator back down and stood on the sidewalk outside his building in the cold air and called Lena. She answered on the second ring. She said, "How did it go?" He said, "We won." She said, "What does that mean for you?" He said, "It means I have a lot of work to do." She said, "Is the shop?" He said, "I had a conversation with Pete. He has known who I was for about 3 months. He said he figured it out when I fixed a transmission that had stumped every other mechanic he'd had in 5 years. She said, "What did you say?" He said, "I said I'd like to buy him a better lift for the shop." She laughed. She actually laughed, and he stood on the sidewalk listening to it. She said, "Are you coming back to the city?" He said, "I am already in the city." She said, "I meant back to the neighborhood." He said, "Yes." She said, "Good." He said, "Are you busy tonight?" She said, "I have blueprints." He said, "Bring them." That evening, sitting at his kitchen table in a small apartment, which he had decided to keep regardless of what his board or anyone else thought, they spread her blueprints between them. Worked. He noticed the load-bearing issue she had been wrestling with. She argued with him. He pulled out a pen and showed her on the drawing itself why he was right. She looked at it for 30 seconds and then said, "Fine." He almost smiled. She said, "You should come see the space." He said, "When?" She said, "Tuesday." He said, "I'll be there." "Why?" She rolled the blueprints back up. She said, "There is something I want to tell you." He said, "Okay." "What?" She said, "When I walked into your shop, I was the most humiliated I had ever been in my adult life. I had just watched the man I was going to marry dancing with someone else, and I had walked out of. a party alone, and I felt about 2 inches tall, and I walked into your shop with this idea that I was going to fix it somehow, put a bandage on my pride, get through one evening, and move on. He was listening, she said. I don't know what I expected. Someone easy to manage, someone I could direct, someone who would play a role and disappear. She looked at him. I did not expect you, he said. What did you get instead? She said. Someone who sees me, not the version I am presenting. The actual me. She paused. I am not used to that, he said. I know. She said. I am going to be difficult about it sometimes, he said. I know, she said. I am going to need you to be patient. He said, I am a mechanic. Patience is most of the job. She looked at him. She said, you are a lot more than a mechanic, he said. I am a mechanic who happens to own a company. She said, that is one way to put it. He said, it is the accurate way. Why, CT Bao. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, okay. He said, okay. He said, okay what? She said, okay. I am in. Whatever this is, I am in. He said, yay. She said, don't make it weird. He said, too late. She laughed again. He thought about how that sound had become, in a very short time, one of his favorite things. 3 months later, Lena's commercial project opened. She had been working on it through every complication and distraction, through the board drama and the Marcus situation and the corporate communications calls and the late nights with blueprints. And it was, by any honest measure, the best work she had ever done. The space was warm and functional and beautiful, and felt, as all of her work, felt like a place where life could happen. Was Bishant, her team was proud. She stood in the finished space on opening night and looked at what she had built and felt the particular satisfaction of someone who has made something real. Steve was there. He stood near the back, the way he always stood, not needing to be at the center of anything, watching with the focused attention he gave everything. She found him near the end of the evening. She said, well, he said, the load-bearing partition is perfect. She said, I know. He said, so is the rest of it. She said, I know that too. Pause. He looked at her. He said, you built this. She said, we argued about it together. He said, you built it. She let that be true. Marcus married the colleague's wife 3 months after that. Lena read about it in the kind of city publication that covered such things, and she felt nothing except a mild, distant sense that the story had found its proper shape. She sent a polite text. He didn't reply. She put her phone down and went back to the blueprints on her table, the new project, larger than the last one, a full city block downtown that a developer had brought to her because someone had told them about the commercial space, and that someone had turned out to be Steve, who had mentioned it to the developer in the course of a meeting without telling Lena. She had found out through the developer. She had confronted Steve. He had said, I mentioned it to someone who needed to hear it. That is not the same as interfering. She had said, it is exactly the same as interfering. He had said, do you want the project? She had said, that is not the point. He had said, do you want the project? She had said, yes. He had said, then let's not argue about how you got it. She had thought about this for a moment. Then she had said, if you ever do something like that again without telling me, I will redesign your office in a way you won't enjoy. He had said, is that a threat? She had said, I am a designer. It is a professional opinion. He had laughed, really laughed. She thought she could live inside that sound. On a Tuesday in April, a year to the week from the day she had walked into a mechanic's shop with a strange request, she arrived at the shop to find it closed. Not abandoned, just closed, on the door that said, around back. She went around to the lot behind the building. Steve was there, working on something, same as always, and there was something next to him on a workbench that she recognized after a moment as a night engine, old and partly disassembled, the kind that belonged to a vehicle built decades ago. She said, what is that? He said, my father's first car. He kept the engine. I've been restoring it. She came closer. She looked at the parts, laid out in precise order on the bench. She said, how long has this been going on? He said, Since I came here, it is what I've been working on when nothing else is in. She looked at the engine. She looked at his hands, careful and knowing on the metal. She thought about what he had told her, what you can build and fix and make right. She said, when it is done, what will you do with it? He said, drive it. She said, where? He looked at her. He said, wherever you want to go. She stood in the lot, in the April light, with the sound of the city around them and the smell of metal and oil in the air, and she thought about a hotel ballroom a year ago and a woman standing, still watching her life fall apart. She thought about the walk out into the cold, the gas station lights, the snap decision that had changed everything. She thought about what her mother had always taught her. You smile when you are hurting. You never let them see you break. She thought, I let him see me break almost, and he stayed anyway. She thought, that is the whole story right there. She said, I'll start thinking of places. He said, good. She stood beside him and looked at the engine, and the April light came through the gaps in the fence, and everything was ordinary, and everything was fine, and it was enough. It was more than Nani Di Do Re Se. It was everything, but that is not where the story ends. 2 weeks after that Tuesday, Lena's phone rang at 11 at night. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. She answered. The voice was a woman's, older, measured. She said, I hope I'm not disturbing you. And then she said her name. It was Margaret Calloway. Steve's mother, Lena, sat up in bed. Margaret said, I've wanted to call for some time. Steve doesn't know I am calling. I want you to know that. A pause. I want to tell you something about my son that I think you should know. Or, Lena said, Mrs. Calloway. Margaret said, he has only ever done one thing in his life that he has regretted. One decision. He has never told me the details, and I have never asked. But it was a relationship, years ago, and, whatever happened, left him with the belief that who he is, all of it, the name, the company, the weight of all of it, was too much for someone to choose willingly. A pause. He has spent a very long time believing that the only thing someone would want is what he has, not who he is. Lena was very quiet. Margaret said, I am telling you this because you are the first person in a very long time who walked toward him when they didn't know what he had. And I think you should know what that means. Even if he hasn't said it, Lena said, he has actually, in his way. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, good. A pause. He gets the stubbornness from his father. Voici que, Lena said, I know. Margaret almost smiled. Lena could hear it. She said, you'll do fine. And she hung up. Lena sat in the dark for a long time. She thought about the woman who had called her. She thought about a boy in Ohio who had turned down scholarships to stay in his father's garage. She thought about 18 months of a man quietly trying to find his way back to something essential about himself. She thought, he found it, or he is finding it. She thought, so am I. She put the phone down and lay back in the dark and thought about the engine on the workbench and the places she was going to think of, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Safe, not because anything was certain, nothing was certain, but because she was exactly where she was supposed to be, with a person who saw her clearly, and she saw him clearly, and they were both still there. That is the whole thing, isn't it? That is all it ever is. You find someone who sees you in the morning light and doesn't look away, and you don't look away either. And that is enough. That is more than enough. That is everything.